On the very first day of our retirement, in the small, perfect lakeside home we had spent our entire lives saving for, our son called. He didn't congratulate us. He didn't ask how we were settling in. He informed us that 20 members of his wife's family were arriving the next day for a 2-week vacation, and that we were expected to be the hosts. That was the moment our dream of a peaceful retirement became an absolute nightmare. But an hour before that phone call, just an hour before the invasion was announced, my wife Helen and I were standing on our new porch, believing, with every fiber of our beings, that we had finally found our own little slice of heaven on earth. Dear friends, we're so happy you're here with us today. Every time you join, it gives us the chance to share stories that might inspire you, guide you, or even change the way you see things. Your comments and support mean the world to us, and we're truly grateful. Tell us, what challenges have you faced in life, or maybe you're facing right now? We might just find a story that feels close to yours, and who knows, it could be exactly what you need. So, stay with us. Don't miss what's coming next. My name is Charles, and I am 72 years old. For 45 of those years, I taught history at a public high school in Atlanta. My wife, Helen, was a pediatric nurse for just as long. We were not wealthy people. We were quiet, hard-working people who paid our bills, raised a good son, and poured every spare dollar into a savings account labeled the Lake House Fund. That fund was our shared dream, the light at the end of the long tunnel of our working lives. And now, here it was. A small, cozy, 2-bedroom cabin nestled in the Georgia pines, overlooking the clear, quiet waters of Lake Blue Ridge. It wasn't a mansion. It was better. It was a home built of cedar and stone, with a large screened-in porch and a dock that was just begging for 2 old folks to sit on it with their morning coffee. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a scent so clean and pure it felt like a tonic for the soul. This was our reward, our peace. We had arrived less than an hour ago, the car still full of boxes. But we couldn't bring ourselves to start unpacking. We just stood on the porch, hand in hand, looking out at the water. The silence of the mountains, a beautiful, welcome blanket around us. "Can you believe it, Charlie?" Helen whispered, her head resting on my shoulder. At 69, she was still the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, her hair a crown of elegant silver, her eyes the same warm, kind brown they'd been the day I met her. "I can't," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It was a mix of gratitude, relief, and a profound, bone-deep sense of accomplishment. We did it, Helen. We actually did it. We had spent our lives in the service of others, our students, our patients, our son, Michael. Now, finally, this time was for us. Our future was a beautiful, unwritten book of quiet mornings, lazy afternoons fishing on the lake, and peaceful evenings reading by the fire. It was in the middle of this perfect, sacred moment that the phone rang, its shrill digital sound a violent intrusion into the natural symphony of the woods. I sighed and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. The screen read, "Michael." A smile touched my lips. He was a good boy, our Michael. A successful lawyer, married to a lovely girl, Tiffany. He was probably calling to congratulate us, to see if we'd arrived safely. "Hey, son," I said cheerfully. "You wouldn't believe this place. The pictures don't do it justice." There was no warmth on the other end of the line, just his voice, clipped, efficient, and full of an authority I had never heard from him before. "Dad, Listen up. I don't have much time. I need you to get ready. Get ready? I asked, confused. For what? Tiffany's family. They're all coming up for a 2-week vacation. A little family reunion. They're leaving in the morning. It'll be about 20 people, all told. Tiff's mom and dad, her 2 brothers and their families, her cousin Sheila with the new baby. Anyway, you get the picture. I stood there, stunned into silence, the phone feeling cold against my ear. 20 people. So, Michael continued, his voice impatient, as if he were giving instructions to an incompetent assistant. I need you and Mom to do a big grocery run. Get enough for a few days at least. Steaks, burgers, vacation food. And make sure the guest room is ready, and you'll probably have to set up some air mattresses. They'll be there by lunchtime tomorrow. My mind was reeling. Michael, I finally stammered. Son, this is a 2-bedroom house. There's no space for 20 people. We just got here. We haven't even unpacked. You'll figure it out, Dad, he said, his voice completely devoid of any understanding. It's the family. You wouldn't want to disappoint Tiffany, would you? And then, before I could answer, before I could protest, he hung up. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The beautiful, peaceful silence of the mountains rushed back in, but it was different now. It was a heavy, menacing silence, filled with the impossible, terrifying reality of what was coming. I looked at Helen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that I knew was a perfect mirror of my own. Our slice of heaven, the quiet, peaceful sanctuary we had worked and saved for our entire lives, was about to be invaded. We just had no idea, in that moment, that it was going to be a hostile takeover. For a long time after the line went dead, neither of us moved. We just stood on the porch of our brand new life, the beautiful, peaceful silence of the mountains, now a mocking testament to the dream that had just been stolen from us. The phantom sound of my son's voice, so full of casual, thoughtless entitlement, echoed in my ears. You'll figure it out, Dad. I was the first to speak, my voice a low, incredulous growl. No, I said, shaking my head. Absolutely not. I'm calling him back right now and telling him to turn that circus around. This is not a hotel. It is not a charity. But as I raised my phone, Helen's hand gently covered mine, stopping me. I looked at her, and in her eyes, I saw not the righteous anger that was burning in my own chest, but a deep, familiar, and heartbreaking sense of resignation. And what do we say, Charlie? She asked, her voice quiet and weary. That they can't come? He said they're already on their way. 20 people. Where will they go? It's Tiffany's family. If we do this, if we turn them away, she will be humiliated. It will cause a fight between them. A real one. That is not our problem, I countered, my voice rising with a frustration that was 45 years in the making. Helen, listen to what you're saying. We have spent our entire lives putting everyone else first. Our students, our patients, our son. We saved, we sacrificed, we did everything right. This, I said, gesturing to the peaceful lake, to the whispering pines. This was supposed to be our time. The very first day, and it's already being taken from us. It's just for 2 weeks, she pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. We can be strong for 2 weeks for Michael's sake. Please, Charlie, let's not start our new life with a family war. We can get through this. I looked at my wife, at the woman I loved more than life itself, and I saw the trap she was in, the trap we were both in. Her appeal to our son's happiness, to the preservation of his marriage, was the one argument I could not defeat. She had spent her life being the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over every conflict, who absorbed every inconvenience to ensure everyone else's comfort. It was a role she didn't know how to quit. And I, in the end, was too weak to force her to. I let out a long, slow breath, the clean mountain air tasting like ash in my mouth. "Fine," I said, the word a bitter stone. "Fine, Helen. We'll do it." For Michael, our first full day in our dream home was not spent unpacking the boxes that held the treasures of our life together. It was not spent sitting on the dock, watching the sunset. It was spent in a frantic, joyless state of preparation for an invasion we did not want. We drove to the small-town grocery store, a place we had dreamed of frequenting as locals. Instead of a leisurely stroll, we engaged in a desperate, high-speed shopping spree, like contestants on a game show. We filled 3 shopping carts to overflowing with mountains of food: bread, milk, eggs, and pounds upon pounds of the steaks and burgers our son had demanded. The total at the checkout came to nearly $600, a catastrophic blow to our carefully planned, fixed-income retirement budget. Back at the cabin, the work continued. We pushed our own comfortable furniture against the walls to make room. We wrestled with 2 large, heavy air mattresses, my 72-year-old back screaming in protest as I tried to inflate them with a foot pump. We stripped the bed in our guest room, the room we had set aside for when Michael and Tiffany came for quiet weekend visits, and we made it up with fresh linens. Our small 2-bedroom slice of heaven was being systematically transformed into a chaotic, overcrowded youth hostel. With every box of crackers I stacked in the pantry, with every towel I folded, my resentment grew, a cold, hard knot in my chest. This was a violation. Our son, in a single thoughtless phone call, had reduced our lifelong dream to a logistical problem for him to solve, and he had made us the unpaid, unwilling solution. By noon the next day, we were as ready as we could be. Every spare inch of floor space was covered with a makeshift bed. The refrigerator, our refrigerator, was crammed with food for strangers. We were exhausted, our bodies aching, our spirits bruised. We hadn't had a single moment to savor our new home, to feel the peace we had come here for. We just sat on our porch swing, 2 tired old people, and we waited. Soon, we heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel of our long driveway. It wasn't 1 car, it was 3. A massive rented minivan crested the hill first, packed to the gills with people and luggage. It was followed by 2 large SUVs, their engines a low, rumbling growl that seemed to tear at the quiet of the mountains. They looked like an invading army. Helen squeezed my hand, her knuckles white. "Just be nice, Charlie," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea. "Let's just get through this." But as I watched those cars kick up clouds of dust on my new driveway, as I saw the sheer, overwhelming number of people about to descend upon our small, fragile peace, I knew this wasn't something we could just get. Through this was the beginning of an occupation. The car doors of the minivan flew open, and our quiet, peaceful world was washed away in a tidal wave of noise and chaos. 20 people, a number that had been an abstract, impossible concept just a day ago, poured out onto our gravel driveway. There were Tiffany's parents, Bob and Brenda, a smug, well-fed couple who looked at our small cabin with undisguised disappointment. There were her 2 brothers, their wives, and a swarm of loud, unruly children who immediately began to run wild, their shrieks echoing through the silent woods. And there was her cousin, Sheila, with a baby on her hip that was already wailing. My son, Michael, and his wife, Tiffany, emerged last, not as apologetic mediators, but as triumphant conquering heroes. "We're here," Tiffany announced, as if we hadn't noticed. No one said, "Thank you for having us." No one said, "What a beautiful place." The first words came from Tiffany's father, Bob, as he cast a critical eye over our home. "Is this it then?" "It's a lot cozier than I pictured." Before I could form a response, his son-in-law, a loud, obnoxious man named Kevin, pushed past me into the house. "Where's the food? We're starving after that drive. And someone show me where the beer is." They swarmed into our small home like a plague of locusts, dropping bags, coolers, and an endless stream of plastic toys onto every available surface. The chaotic, joyful mess of a family reunion can be a beautiful thing when it's built on a foundation of love and respect. This was not that. This was a hostile, thoughtless invasion. The final, definitive act of the occupation came within the first 10 minutes. Tiffany's mother, Brenda, a woman with a sharp, calculating gaze, walked through our small home, assessing it not as a guest, but as an inspector. She peered into the guest room, which Kevin and his family had already claimed. Then she opened the door to our bedroom, our sanctuary. The one room Helen and I had managed to unpack a few of our personal things in. "Oh, this is much better," Brenda announced to the room at large. "Sheila, honey," she called to the cousin with the crying baby, "you and the little one can take this room. It's the largest, and you'll need the private bathroom." It's the only sensible arrangement. It was not a request. It was a decree. I looked at Michael, my son, expecting him to intervene, to defend his own parents' dignity. He just nodded in agreement. "Yeah, Mom, that makes sense. We've got to make sure the baby is comfortable." I stood there, speechless, as Sheila and her husband began to move our personal belongings, my book from the nightstand, Helen's reading glasses, and pile them unceremoniously on a hallway chair to make room for their own things. And just like that, in the space of 10 minutes, we had become homeless within our own home. Our designated sleeping quarters were to be the lumpy, 30-year-old sofa bed in the living room, a space that was now the central highway for 20 strangers. Helen, the consummate, long-suffering hostess, immediately went into damage control, trying to bring a sense of order to the chaos. She started directing people to the food we had bought, the food they immediately began to complain about. "No organic juice boxes for the kids? Is this the only brand of chips you have?" I couldn't take it. I retreated to the porch, my only remaining sanctuary, and sank into one of the rocking chairs. I could hear the chaos inside, the television blasting, the children screaming, the adults arguing over who got which air mattress. My dream of peace, of quiet, of a life that was finally my own, was dead. It had not even survived a full 24 hours. Later that night, long after the last of the steaks had been devoured and the mountain of paper plates had been thrown away, Helen and I lay on the lumpy, creaking sofa bed. Sleep was an impossibility. The thin mattress sagged in the middle, and the springs dug into my back. People were still up, walking back and forth to the kitchen, their conversations loud and thoughtless. In the back of the house, in our bedroom, Sheila's baby was crying, a relentless, piercing wail. Around midnight, Tiffany's father, Bob, came out of the guest room in his pajamas and went to the refrigerator for another beer. He saw me lying there, my eyes wide open in the darkness. He took a long, noisy gulp of his beer and then looked down at me with a frown. "Hey, Charles," he said, his voice a low, annoyed rumble. "You mind keeping it down out here? Your talking is keeping some of us awake." I just stared at him. I had not said a word. He had mistaken the sound of my wife's quiet, muffled sobs for talking. To be told to be quiet by a stranger in my own home while he drank the beer I had paid for after he had stolen my bedroom, it was the final, perfect, soul-crushing insult. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of my wife crying and the stranger's footsteps as he went back to his room. And I realized, with a clarity that was as cold and as hard as the floor beneath me, that this was not a family vacation. This was a war, and I had just been made a prisoner in my own home. The first morning of the occupation began not with the gentle bird song I had dreamed of, but with the thunderous, chaotic noise of 17 children, or at least, that's what it sounded like, demanding breakfast. I awoke on the lumpy sofa bed at 6 a.m. to the smell of burning toast and the sound of cartoons blasting from our television at a deafening volume. Helen was already in the kitchen, a prisoner in her own apron, frantically trying to flip pancakes on a griddle that was far too small for the army she was expected to feed. The dream of a quiet, shared cup of coffee on the porch was replaced by the harsh reality of being unpaid, unappreciated, and utterly exhausted short-order cooks. The kitchen, our kitchen, which we had lovingly planned to keep tidy and organized, was a disaster zone. Empty cereal boxes and milk cartons littered the counters. Children with sticky hands ran in and out, letting the screen door slam behind them, while their parents sat at our dining table, scrolling on their phones and complaining about the weak Wi-Fi signal. "The connection out here's a joke," Tiffany's brother, Kevin, announced to no one in particular. "How are the kids supposed to stream their shows?" By 10 a.m., the groceries we had spent a fortune on were already decimated. Tiffany's mother, Brenda, approached Helen with a new list, her expression one of deep and profound inconvenience. "Helen, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we're completely out of the organic, gluten-free waffles for little Caden, and Bob can't drink this generic coffee. He needs the imported dark roast from the specialty store. And the children will only drink bottled spring water, not water from a tap in the mountains, for heaven's sake." There was, of course, no offer to pay for any of it. The expectation was as clear and as cold as the lake water. This was our duty. This was our price for the privilege of their company. I was the one who had to get in the car, drive 30 minutes to the nearest town with a specialty grocery store, and spend another $300 from our rapidly dwindling savings account on organic waffles and fancy coffee for these strangers. When I returned, I found a new violation in progress. Kevin and Tiffany's other brother, Mark, had discovered my late father's fishing equipment, which I had reverently placed in a corner of the porch. These were not modern graphite rods. They were beautiful antique bamboo rods, their reels a complex and delicate work of brass and steel. They were my most cherished possessions, a tangible link to my own father, to the quiet, happy days he had taught me to fish on a different lake, a lifetime ago. They were preparing to take them down to the dock. "Hold on," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Those are antiques, boys. They're not really for using. They're very delicate." Kevin just laughed, a loud, obnoxious bark. "Don't be a spoilsport, Charles. What's the point of having a lake house if you can't fish? We'll be careful." I looked to my son, Michael, for support. He was standing right there. "Dad, come on," he said, with an embarrassed, placating smile. "Let them have some fun. What's the harm? Don't be selfish. The word was a hot poker in my gut. To want to protect the last sacred memory I had of my own father was selfish. Defeated, I stood by and watched as they took my father's beautiful, delicate rods and marched down to the dock, treating them with all the care of a couple of cheap sticks they'd found in the woods. I knew, with a sick certainty, that they would not come back in the same condition. The rest of the day was a blur of endless, thankless labor. We cooked, we cleaned, we washed mountains of dishes, we picked up wet towels, we took out overflowing bags of trash. We were two elderly people, running a marathon of domestic servitude for 20 able-bodied adults who treated us as if we were invisible. The breaking point came that evening as the sun began to set. The house was, for a brief moment, quiet, as the entire clan had gone down to the lake to swim. The broken fishing rod, the tip snapped clean off, had been returned with a careless, "Oops, sorry about that," from Kevin, and then immediately forgotten. I found Helen on the front porch, sitting in one of the rocking chairs, her face in her hands. She wasn't making a sound, but I could see her shoulders shaking with silent, heartbroken sobs. The peacekeeper, the woman who had sacrificed her own comfort for her family her entire life, had finally, completely, run out of the strength to do it anymore. I sat down beside her, my own heart a leaden weight in my chest. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me, her tears finally coming, hot and wet against my shirt. "What have we done, Charlie?" she whispered. "This isn't our home. It's a prison." As I sat there, trying to find words of comfort that I didn't feel, a small, older car pulled into the driveway of the cabin next door. A woman got out. She was tall and elegant, an African-American woman who looked to be in her late 70s, with a crown of beautiful white hair and a gaze that was as sharp and as clear as a hawk's. She had seen the chaotic arrival yesterday, had heard the noise all day. She looked from Helen's tear-streaked face to the chaotic noise still faintly audible from the lake, and then she looked directly at me. "Good evening," she said, her voice like warm honey in old steel. "My name is Hattie. Looks like you two have a bad case of the relatives." And in that moment, for the first time in 2 long, terrible days, I felt like someone was actually seeing us. Not as hosts, not as parents, not as servants, but as 2 people in a world of trouble. Miss Hattie's presence on our porch was like a lighthouse appearing in the middle of a storm. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell us to just hang in there. She simply looked at Helen's tear-streaked face, listened to the raucous noise of our invaders down by the lake, and nodded her head with the slow, grim wisdom of a woman who had seen the ways of the world. "You two come on over to my place," she said, her voice a calm, firm command. "Leave this foolishness behind for a minute. I've got a fresh pitcher of sweet tea and a porch that's 100 years deep in peace and quiet." We followed her, 2 lost sheep, across the small patch of grass that separated our properties. Her cabin was almost identical to ours, but it felt entirely different. It was a home. The garden was neat and bursting with color, and her porch was an oasis of calm, with comfortable wicker chairs and pots of blooming geraniums. As she handed us tall, cool glasses of sweet tea, the simple act of her hospitality, of being served instead of serving, was so overwhelming I thought I might break down myself. We sat there on her peaceful porch, and the whole ugly story came pouring out of us. We told her about the phone call, the demands, being kicked out of our own bedroom, the broken fishing rod, the endless, thankless servitude. She listened patiently, without interruption, her dark eyes missing nothing. When we were finished, she set her glass down with a soft click. She looked at Helen, her gaze both gentle and fiercely protective. "Honey," she said, her voice losing its gentle edge and taking on the hardness of old steel. "Let me tell you what I see. That ain't a family visit happening over there. That's a home invasion, just without the broken glass. That is a hostile takeover." The words, so blunt and so true, were a shock of cold water. "You two worked your entire lives for this," she continued, her gaze now including me. "You earned this peace. You paid for it with your sweat and your time. Family is supposed to respect that. Family is supposed to cherish their elders, not use them up like an old dish rag. What they are doing to you is a sin, and you have every right in God's world to put a stop to it." "But how?" Helen asked, her voice a broken whisper. "He's my son. They're my family." "No," Miss Hattie said, leaning forward. "Your son is the man who is allowing his wife's family to abuse his own mother and father. A title doesn't make you family. Love and respect make you family. And right now, there's no respect in that house." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper with a name and a number on it. "Sympathy and tears won't get them out of your house," she said, handing the paper to me. "A strategy will. This here is Ben Carter. He's the best lawyer in this town. My late husband and I used him for our will. He's a good man, but he is tough as a $2 steak, and he does not play games when it comes to protecting folks' property and their peace of mind. You call him." We left Miss Hattie's porch a different couple than the one that had arrived. The fog of helpless despair had begun to lift, replaced by the first faint glimmer of a fighting chance. We were no longer just victims. We were clients. We had a strategy. The peacekeeper in my wife had finally been confronted with the truth she could not ignore, and the helpless anger in my own heart was now being channeled into a cold, clear sense of purpose. We returned to our house, now filled once again with the noise and chaos of the returning invaders. But this time, it was different. We moved through the evening's demands with a new, secret resolve. We were no longer just enduring. We were observing. We were gathering evidence. The next morning, we waited. We watched as the entire clan, with our son Michael leading the charge, prepared for another big day out. They packed up the coolers with the food we had bought. They grabbed the beach towels we had been forced to purchase, and they chattered excitedly about renting a large pontoon boat for the afternoon, a purchase they had not yet asked us to make. But we knew the demand was coming. As the last of their 3 cars rumbled down our driveway, a beautiful, profound silence descended upon the house. It was the first moment of real peace we'd had in 3 days. Helen looked at me from across the messy, chaotic living room, a new, steely glint in her eyes that I had not seen in a very long time. "It's time to make that call," she said. I nodded, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. I pulled the piece of paper from my pocket and dialed the number. We got in our car a little while later, 2 retirees dressed for a quiet drive into town. The house was a wreck, the kitchen was a disaster, and our peace was still a distant dream. But for the first time since our son's phone call, we were a team again, united in a single, common mission. No one would have guessed, seeing us pull out of our driveway, that we were actually 2 soldiers, heading to our first secret briefing in a war to reclaim our own home. The lawyer's office was on the 2nd floor of a historic brick building on the town's main square. It was a quiet, dignified space, filled with the scent of old books and lemon polish. It felt like a sanctuary of order after the chaotic anarchy of our home. Ben Carter, The man Miss Hattie had called tough as a $2 steak was a surprise. He was a man around our own age, with a kind, weathered face, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. He listened to our entire sordid story without a single interruption, his hands steepled, his expression growing grimmer with each new detail of disrespect we recounted. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, a deep, thoughtful frown on his face. "Well," he finally said, his voice a calm, steady baritone. "Miss Hattie was right. This isn't a family visit. This is an occupation, and a particularly brazen one at that." "So what can we do?" I asked, my voice tight with a frustration that felt like it had been simmering for days. "Can we call the sheriff and have them thrown out for trespassing?" Ben shook his head slowly. "You could," he said, "but I wouldn't advise it. Legally, they are your invitees. You haven't explicitly asked them to leave yet. If you call the law, it becomes a messy, he said, she said situation. It will be traumatic for you, and it will permanently destroy your relationship with your son. They will paint you as the cruel, unstable old parents who called the police on their own family. It's the nuclear option, and right now, you'd be the ones left standing in the fallout." Helen's shoulders slumped, a look of despair on her face. "So there's nothing we can do," she said, her voice flat. "We just have to endure it." "I didn't say that," Ben said, a slow, cunning smile spreading across his face. "I said we can't evict them as trespassers. But we are under no obligation to run a 5-star, all-inclusive resort free of charge." He leaned forward, the kind country lawyer suddenly replaced by a sharp legal strategist. "Your home is a private residence, not a public charity. So, we are going to change the legal definition of their stay. We are going to turn this from a family visit into a business transaction." Helen and I just stared at him, confused. "Here's what we're going to do," he continued, the energy in the room shifting. "We are not going to ask them to leave. We are going to present them with a choice. We are going to draft an official itemized invoice for services rendered and for services to be rendered for the remainder of their 2-week stay." He started to tick the points off on his fingers. First, lodging. My assistant is, as we speak, looking up the market rate for a 2-bedroom lakefront vacation rental in this area that can accommodate, shall we say, a large party. We will bill them the nightly rate. Second, a food and beverage stipend. We will calculate a reasonable per diem for each of the 20 guests. Third, utilities and incidentals, a daily charge for the extra water, electricity, and wear and tear on the property. He smiled again. And the most important part will be the final clause. Payment for the full 2-week stay is due in advance. If payment is not rendered, the short-term rental agreement is considered null and void, and all guests will be required to vacate the premises within 12 hours. I stared at him, a sense of stunned, brilliant admiration dawning on me. The genius of it was breathtaking. It wasn't an eviction. It was a bill. It forced them to put a price tag on their own entitlement. It called their bluff. Were they family, here to share in our lives? Or were they just freeloading consumers of a free luxury vacation? "But they'll be furious," Helen gasped, the peacekeeper in her horrified by this direct confrontation. "Michael will never, ever forgive us for this." Ben's gaze softened as he looked at my wife. "Mrs. Miller," he said gently, "is a son who allows his parents to be treated like unpaid servants in their own home truly asking for your love? Or is he just demanding your unconditional compliance, You have a right to the peace you have earned. This is the moment you find out if your son and his new family respect that right. The choice of what happens next will be theirs, not yours." I looked at Helen, and I knew he was right. I reached across the table and took her hand. "He's right, Helen," I said, my voice full of a new, firm resolve. "We have to do this. For us." She looked at me, her eyes full of fear, but she gave a single, determined nod. We left the lawyer's office an hour later, the sun warm on our faces. In Helen's trembling hand was a crisp, professional invoice, printed on the official letterhead of the Carter law firm. The grand total, for 2 weeks of lodging, food, and services for 20 people, came to $5,780. The document felt like a bomb in the car with us as we drove back to our occupied home. As we pulled into our driveway, the scene was one of chaotic, thoughtless celebration. Music was blasting from a portable speaker on the porch. Wet towels and empty beer cans littered the lawn. They were all there, laughing, partying, living their best life, in our home, on our dime, completely and utterly oblivious. They had no idea that their free ride was about to come to a very expensive and a very abrupt end. We returned from the lawyer's office to a house that was, if possible, even more chaotic than when we had left it. The invaders had fully established their beachhead. Wet towels and swimsuits were draped over every piece of furniture. The floor was gritty with sand tracked in from the lake, and the television was blasting a noisy, obnoxious children's show at a volume that made the windows vibrate. No one seemed to notice our return. We were just two ghosts, drifting through the wreckage of our own home. The invoice, our secret weapon, was tucked away in a manila folder in my briefcase. As I hid it away in the back of our temporary closet, I knew we couldn't act yet. The timing had to be perfect. For now, we had to endure. We had to continue playing the part of the meek, accommodating hosts for a few more hours. That evening, as we all gathered for dinner, the final, unforgivable straw was laid upon my already broken back. Helen had spent what little energy she had left preparing a large, beautiful meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. It was a heroic effort, an act of pure, unreciprocated grace. The entire clan was seated around our dining table, which we had extended with a rickety card table from the garage. They ate with the voracious, unthinking hunger of people who had not paid for their meal and had no intention of helping to clean it up. In the middle of the meal, Tiffany's father, Bob, the patriarch of this marauding tribe, put down his fork with a loud clatter. "It's good, Helen," he announced, as if he were a food critic delivering a reluctant verdict. "But it's a little plain, isn't it? My Brenda now, she uses a paprika rub on her chicken. Gives it a bit of a kick. You should try that next time." I saw Helen flinch, a small, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. After spending the entire afternoon cooking for 20 people, her effort was dismissed as plain. I felt a hot surge of protective rage, but before I could speak, Tiffany's brother, Kevin, wiped his mouth and looked at me, a greedy, expectant gleam in his eye. "So, Charles," he said, his voice booming across the table, "we did some research. The marina down the road rents a 24-foot pontoon boat, perfect for the whole family. It's only about $800 for the rest of the week. It's a steal. I figured you could just call them in the morning and put your credit card down over the phone. It'll be easier than all of us trying to chip in." And there it was. The insult, followed immediately by the invoice. The casual, smiling assumption that my wallet was a bottomless public resource for their entertainment. I looked at my son, Michael, expecting him to say something, to intervene. He just sat there, shoveling mashed potatoes into his mouth, a silent, willing accomplice to our humiliation. Something inside me, a part of my spirit that had been beaten down and dormant for years, finally snapped. Not with a loud, angry crack, but with a quiet, cold, and final sense of clarity. I was done. We were done. I slowly placed my knife and fork on my plate. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. Then I stood up. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to me, surprised by the sudden formal gesture. "If you'll all excuse me for a moment," I said, my voice perfectly calm, but carrying a new and unfamiliar weight of authority that made even Kevin stop chewing. I walked out of the dining room, down the short hall, and into the makeshift bedroom where I kept my briefcase. I opened it and took out the manila folder. I slid the crisp, white, beautifully typed invoice from its sleeve. This was it. The point of no return. I could go back to that table, swallow the insults and the demands, and endure another 10 days of this living hell. Or I could end it. Right now. I walked back into the dining room. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the table, the patriarch in my own home, a role I had abdicated for 3 long days. "Michael." "Tiffany," I said, my gaze steady. "Bob." "Brenda." "After you have all finished your meal, Helen and I would like you to join us in the living room for a family meeting. We have an important announcement to make regarding the terms and conditions of the remainder of your stay with us." The confident, jovial atmosphere at the table evaporated, replaced by a tense, confused silence. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of annoyance and intrigue. They thought they were about to get a polite, pleading lecture about cleaning up after themselves. They had no idea they were about to be served with their own eviction notice. The rest of the meal was eaten in a strained, awkward silence. When it was over, Helen and I went to the kitchen to clean, as we always did. But this time, we worked as a silent, unified team. The invoice lay on the kitchen counter between us, a declaration of independence waiting to be signed. When the last dish was dried, Helen turned to me. Her face was pale, her hands were trembling, but her eyes were full of a new, fierce, and beautiful resolve. She gave me a single, determined nod. It was time. We walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, where the entire expectant family was waiting for us, their faces a mixture of impatience and curiosity. I held the crisp white invoice in my hand. It felt less like a piece of paper and more like a weapon. Their free ride was over. The revolution was about to begin. We stood together in the living room, a silent, unified front, and watched as the 20 members of our extended family settled onto our sofas and chairs. They were restless, annoyed, their expressions a mixture of impatience and condescending amusement. They believed they were about to be subjected to a gentle, pleading lecture about being tidier. They had no idea they were about to be presented with a declaration of war. Charles cleared his throat, and the low murmur of conversation in the room died down. "Thank you all for gathering," he began, his voice calm, steady, and devoid of the hesitant, accommodating tone they were used to hearing from him. "Helen and I have had some time to assess the logistics of your 2-week stay with us. And as this is our first time hosting an event of this magnitude, we felt it was important to move our arrangement onto a more professional footing." He leaned forward and placed the single, crisp white sheet of paper on the coffee table in the center of the room. My son, Michael, was the first to react, a confused frown on his face. He picked up the paper. "What is this?" he asked. He read the header aloud, his voice full of disbelief. Invoice. Short-term lodging and hospitality services? A ripple of confused laughter went through the room. Tiffany's brother, Kevin, the one who had broken my father-in-law's fishing rod, snatched the paper from Michael's hand. "Let me see that," he snorted. He began to read the itemized list in a loud, mocking voice. Lodging, lakefront mountain view property, occupancy 20 persons, at $350 per night. Ha! You wish this little shack was worth that much, Charles. The room filled with condescending chuckles. Food and beverage stipend, Kevin continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. $50 per person per day. That's $1,000 a day. For what? Pancakes and some burnt chicken? More laughter. They thought it was a joke, a pathetic, passive-aggressive attempt by the old folks to make a point. And the grand total, ladies and gentlemen, he announced with a grand flourish, for the full 14-day stay, $5,780. Unbelievable. He tossed the paper back onto the table as the room erupted in jeering laughter. I watched their faces, their derisive, mocking smiles. And I felt the last of my fear, the last of my desire to keep the peace, burn away into a cold, hard ash. I waited for their laughter to die down, and then I spoke. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence that followed like a shard of glass. "It is not a joke," I said. The smiles on their faces faltered. They looked from my calm, serious expression to my husband's. Charles's face was a mask of unyielding, quiet resolve. The room was suddenly, completely silent. "As the invoice states," Charles continued, his voice the calm, steady instrument of our shared will, "payment for the full 2-week stay is due in advance. If you wish to continue enjoying our hospitality, that amount is payable in full tonight. We accept cash or a certified check. Otherwise, checkout is tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. sharp." For a moment, there was only stunned, absolute silence as the reality of the situation crashed down upon them. And then, the room exploded. It was a cacophony of pure, incandescent rage. "This is insane! You've lost your minds!" Tiffany's father, Bob, roared, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "After we drove all this way, with the children," his wife, Brenda, shrieked. "You're throwing your own family out on the street?" But the loudest voice of all was Tiffany's. She stood up, her pretty face contorted into an ugly mask of outrage. "We are family!" she screamed, the word a weapon she had used her entire life to get what she wanted. "You don't do this to family." And that's when I stood up. I, Helen Miller, the quiet peacekeeper, the woman who had spent her entire life smoothing things over, had finally found my voice. "Family respects each other, Tiffany," I said, and my voice, though it trembled slightly, was filled with a strength I didn't know I possessed. The room fell silent again, shocked by my uncharacteristic defiance. "Family does not invade," I continued, my gaze sweeping across their stunned, angry faces. "Family does not demand. Family does not take over their parents' bedroom and relegate them to a sofa. Family does not break a cherished heirloom and then laugh about it. And they certainly do not treat their elders like a walking, talking ATM machine. For 3 days, you have not behaved like family. You have behaved like rude, entitled customers. So, we have decided to treat you as such." Charles stood beside me then, a solid, unwavering wall of support. "The terms are on the paper," he said, his voice the final closing word on the matter. "You can pay to stay. or you are free to leave. The choice is entirely yours. And with that, we turned, walked out of the chaotic, furious living room and onto our dark, quiet porch, closing the door behind us on the life we used to have. We sat there in the cool night air, in our rocking chairs, listening to the muffled sounds of their disbelief and rage. We had no idea what they would do, whether they would pay or pack. But for the first time in 3 long, terrible days, the fear was gone, replaced by a profound and terrifying peace. We had finally taken our home back. Now we just had to wait and see if they would give it to us. We sat on our porch in the cool, dark night, 2 silent soldiers in the aftermath of a battle. The beautiful natural symphony of the mountains, the chirping of crickets, the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, was a quiet backdrop to the ugly, human storm raging inside our home. Muffled shouts and angry, incredulous voices leaked through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. We didn't speak. We just sat, side by side in our rocking chairs, a united front, and we waited. This was the first time in 30 years we had stood together against our own son. For his entire life, Helen had been the peacekeeper, the mediator, the one who would absorb any conflict to keep the family waters calm. And I, in my own quiet way, had always acquiesced, allowing her to put Michael's comfort and happiness above our own. But tonight, a line had been crossed, and we had finally, in perfect, unspoken unison, decided to hold that line together. I could picture the scene inside as if I were a fly on the wall. I could imagine the factions forming. Tiffany's parents, Bob and Brenda, would be leading the charge of the outraged, their faces puce with indignation. The nerve of them! After we came all this way, Tiffany's brothers would be posturing, full of a useless macho anger. We should just stay. What are they gonna do? Physically throw us out? The other relatives, the ones with less skin in the game, would be nervously trying to figure out the logistics of finding a motel for 20 people in a sleepy mountain town at a moment's notice. And at the center of it all would be my son, Michael, being torn in two. His loyalty to his wife and her family pulling him in one direction, and the shocking, unfamiliar defiance of his parents pulling him in the other. After about 20 minutes of the muffled shouting, the front door was thrown open, and Michael stormed out onto the porch. He was the chosen ambassador, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Are you two happy now?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a rage I had never seen from him. "They're all in there packing. You've completely humiliated Tiffany. You've ruined this entire vacation. This was supposed to be a wonderful family memory, and you've turned it into a nightmare." I looked at my son, at the man I had raised, who was now standing on my porch, yelling at me for having the audacity to demand respect in my own home. "This is insane, Dad," he pleaded, his anger giving way to a desperate frustration. "You're tearing this family apart over a few $1,000s. Just go in there. Tell them it was a stupid joke, apologize, and we can fix this. We can go back to how it was." It was Helen who answered. Her voice was quiet, but it was filled with the sad, unshakable strength of a woman who had finally been pushed too far. "No, Michael," she said softly. "We can never go back to how it was." That's the whole point. I stood up then and faced my son. "This was never about the money, and you know it," I said, my voice low and steady. "This is about respect. It is about the simple, common decency of not treating your own parents like servants. A lesson that it seems we failed to teach you. Now go back inside and tell your new family that the terms are non-negotiable." He stared at us, at the two calm, united people who had replaced his docile, compliant parents. He saw that there was no weakness here, no crack in our resolve for him to exploit. Defeated, he turned without another word and went back into the house, closing the door on the war he had started. The angry shouting inside continued for a while longer, but then it began to change. The sounds of rage were slowly replaced by the sounds of reluctant, resentful action. The angry thud of suitcases being thrown on the floor. The sharp, angry zipping of bags. The hissed, furious commands of parents trying to wrangle their tired, confused children. They had made their choice. Their pride, their entitlement, their refusal to admit any wrongdoing was more valuable to them than we were. They would rather pack up and leave in a storm of self-righteous anger than pay a single dollar or offer a single genuine apology. The house grew quieter as the night wore on. One by one, the lights in the guest rooms and the living room went out. Charles and Helen finally went back inside. The main living area was empty, a mess of discarded cups and snack wrappers. We lay down on the lumpy sofa bed one last time. It was just as uncomfortable as it had been the night before, the springs digging into our backs. But the feeling was entirely different. It was the bed of victors. We lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of their defeat coming from the bedrooms, the angry thud of a closing suitcase, the sharp, whispered curses of a family in retreat. The war was over, and we had won, though the cost was still unknown. And I knew that the silence that was coming with the morning sun would be the loudest, most costly, and most beautiful sound I had ever heard. We awoke the next morning before the sun, not from the sound of crying babies or shouting children, but from the deep, ingrained habit of a lifetime of early rising. We made a pot of coffee and took our mugs out to the porch, just as we had dreamed of doing. We sat in our rocking chairs, two silent sentinels, and we waited for the sun to come up on the first day of our new life. The house behind us was eerily quiet. There was no cartoon-fueled chaos, no demands for breakfast. There was only the sound of a grim, resentful retreat. Around 7 o'clock, the exodus began. The front door opened, and Tiffany's brother, Kevin, emerged, dragging a large suitcase. He did not look at us. His face was a mask of sullen, childish anger. He threw his family's bags into his SUV with a series of loud, aggressive thuds, a petty, final act of protest. One by one, in a silent, angry procession, they emerged from our home. They did not speak to us. They did not look at us. They moved with a hurried, furious energy, loading their cars, wrangling their children, their faces tight with a sense of profound and deeply wronged entitlement. They were the victims here, their expression seemed to say. We were the cruel, inhospitable villains who had denied them their rightful free vacation. The last to leave were Michael and Tiffany. Tiffany walked straight to her car without a single glance in our direction, her back ramrod straight with indignation. But Michael, my son, paused at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at us, his face a complex and painful mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion. "I hope you're both happy," he said, his voice cold and brittle. "You got what you wanted. You chose this house, this stupid little cabin, over your own family." I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man I had loved, and my heart ached with a profound and terrible sadness. But the weakness, the urge to concede and keep the peace, was gone. "No, son," I said, my voice quiet and full of a sad final clarity. "You've got it all wrong. We didn't choose the house. We chose ourselves. We chose to be treated with respect. That's all we ever wanted." I am so sorry that you can't see the difference." He just stared at me, the simple truth of my words, a concept so foreign to his new, entitled world that he could not comprehend it. He shook his head, a small, bitter gesture of defeat, and then he turned and walked to his car, getting in beside the woman for whom he had been willing to sacrifice his own parents. We watched as their car turned around and rumbled down the gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the morning air like a funeral shroud. And then they were gone. All 20 of them. A profound, almost deafening silence descended upon our small patch of the world. It was the beautiful, blessed quiet we had been dreaming of for 45 years. But it was a silence that was haunted by the ghost of the son we had just lost. We sat there for a long time, Helen and I, not speaking, just listening to the sound of the birds and the wind in the pines. We were adrift in a sea of quiet emotion, processing the magnitude of the battle we had just won and the terrible price we had paid for the victory. Finally, Helen stood up, her expression one of weary resolve. "Well," she said, her voice the first human sound to break the silence in over an hour. "Let's go and reclaim our home." We walked inside, and the full, devastating aftermath of the 3-day occupation hit us. The house was a disaster zone. The living room was a tangled mess of deflated air mattresses and discarded snack food wrappers. The kitchen sink was overflowing with dirty dishes, the counters sticky with spilled juice. A trail of muddy footprints led from the back door to the bedrooms. It was the physical manifestation of the disrespect we had been shown. A final parting insult from a family that had taken everything and given nothing. The old Helen would have been overwhelmed, would have sat down and cried at the sheer, thankless magnitude of the task ahead. But the woman standing beside me now was not the old Helen. She surveyed the wreckage, a look of grim determination on her face. She walked to the kitchen, took 2 pairs of yellow rubber gloves from under the sink, and handed one to me. "Let's get to work," she said. And so, we began the great reclamation. We worked as a silent, efficient team. We took out bag after bag of trash. We stripped the beds and gathered the mountains of damp, dirty towels. We washed every single dish, and we scrubbed every single floor. It was hard, physical, and deeply cathartic work. With every bag of trash we removed, with every sticky spot we wiped away, it felt like we were cleansing our home, not just of the physical mess, but of the toxic, spiritual residue of their presence. Hours later, we were finished. The house was spotless. The air mattresses were packed away. The furniture was back in its rightful place. I took my father's fishing rods, the one broken, which I would one day repair, and placed them back in their corner of honor. We moved our own things back into our own bedroom. That evening, exhausted and aching, we stood on our porch and watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the lake in breathtaking shades of orange and gold. The house behind us was clean, the silence was ours, and the world, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, was exactly as it should be. The peace we had dreamed of had come at a terrible, heartbreaking price. But as I looked at my wife's strong, tired, and beautiful face, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that we would have paid it 1,000 times over. The first week of our new quiet life was a strange and beautiful thing. The silence that had initially felt so loud and full of loss slowly softened, transforming into a gentle, healing peace. The house, now scrubbed clean of the chaotic energy of our invaders, began to feel like our own. We fell into a simple, wonderful routine, the one we had dreamed of for decades. We would wake with the sun, make a pot of coffee, and take our mugs down to the dock. We'd sit there for an hour, not talking much, just watching the mist burn off the lake as the world woke up. The mornings were for us. In the afternoons, I would take a simple new fishing rod, not my father's precious antiques, and try my luck off the dock, while Helen would sit on the porch, reading the thick novels she had never had time for before. In the evenings, we would cook a simple meal, just for two, and eat it on the screened-in porch, listening to the crickets and the frogs begin their nightly symphony. It was a life of profound and perfect peace. But it was a peace that had been bought at a high price, a fact we were reminded of by the silence of our telephone. We heard nothing from Michael. Not a text, not a call. The only communication was a single, cold email from Tiffany to Helen with the subject line, "Your things." The email informed us that a box of our remaining personal effects from our old house in Atlanta, a few photo albums and keepsakes we had not yet moved, had been left with a neighbor for us to collect at our convenience. The message was clear. The locks had been changed, and we were no longer welcome in the home we had lived in for 40 years, the home we had gifted to our son. The finality of it was a source of a quiet, constant ache, especially for Helen. I would sometimes see her staring off into the distance, her expression full of a mother's particular, inconsolable grief. But the new, steely resolve she had found that night on the porch never wavered. Our true salvation in those first few lonely weeks was Miss Hattie. She became our first and dearest friend in this new life, the matriarch of our new, chosen family. She would appear on our porch with a basket of fresh-baked biscuits in the morning, or we would go to her place for a glass of lemonade in the afternoon. With her, we found a community. She told us stories of the lake, of the families who had lived in these mountains for generations. She introduced us to the other year-round residents, to the gruff but kind owner of the local hardware store, to the woman who sold the best fresh corn at the farmer's market. With Miss Hattie as our guide, we were no longer two isolated retirees in a cabin. We were becoming a part of the fabric of this small, quiet town. We were putting down new roots. The first real test of our new peace came about a month after the invasion. It was our grandson's birthday, our only grandchild. For the past 10 years of his life, his birthday had been a major event for us, a celebration we had always been at the center of. This year, we were not invited. We only knew it was happening because I saw the pictures Tiffany posted on social media, a series of bright, happy photos of a large party at our old house in Atlanta. Michael was there, Tiffany was there, Bob and Brenda were there, all of them smiling for the camera as if nothing had happened, as if we had simply ceased to exist. I found Helen sitting on the porch swing, quietly looking at the pictures on her phone, tears streaming down her face. "Did we do the right thing, Charlie?" she whispered, her voice thick with pain. "We're missing his life. We're missing everything. Was it worth it?" I sat down beside her and put my arm around her shaking shoulders. The old Charles might have faltered, might have suggested we call and apologize just to be let back into the fold. But that man was gone. "Look at me, Helen," I said, my voice gentle but firm. I waited until her tear-filled eyes met mine. Yes, it was worth it. We are missing one birthday party, but we were on the verge of missing the entire rest of our own lives. What they did to us was not a mistake. It was a choice. And what we did, it was not a punishment. It was a consequence. We did the right thing. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there for a long time, watching the sun set. Two old people who had chosen their own peace over the toxic, demanding performance of a family that had never truly valued them. A few weeks later, Miss Hattie invited us to the town's annual fall potluck supper, held in the community hall. As we were leaving, I noticed a flyer tacked to the bulletin board. The County Historical Society was looking for volunteer docents to lead tours at a nearby historic battlefield site. I, the retired history teacher who thought his days of telling stories were over, felt a familiar, long-lost spark of excitement. At that same moment, Helen was in a deep conversation with the wife of the town doctor. I overheard the woman complaining that the small local clinic was desperate for experienced nurses to volunteer for their annual children's flu shot drive. We walked home that evening under a brilliant star-filled sky, a new and excited energy between us. I looked at Helen, and she was smiling a real, genuine smile, the kind of happy, purposeful smile I hadn't seen on her face in years. "A history guide," she said, nudging my arm playfully. "A clinic volunteer," I replied, my own heart feeling lighter than it had in a decade. It turned out our retirement wasn't going to be an ending at all. It was just the beginning of a different kind of work, a different kind of service. A life that was, finally and completely, on our own terms. The weeks that followed the town potluck were a quiet revolution in our lives. The flyer I had seen on the bulletin board had sparked a flame I thought had long been extinguished. I, Charles Miller, retired history teacher, became a volunteer docent at the local battlefield park, a beautiful, somber place that had witnessed a small but pivotal skirmish in the Civil War. My first day, I was nervous. I stood before a small group of tourists, my hands trembling slightly as I held my notes. But then I began to speak. I told them the stories of the young men, boys really, from both the North and the South, who had fought and died on this very ground. I spoke of their courage, their fear, their belief in their cause. And as I spoke, the passion for my subject, the love of history that had defined my professional life, came rushing back, not as a job, but as a calling. I wasn't just reciting facts and dates. I was a storyteller, a keeper of the memories of the past. The tourists listened, captivated. At the end of the tour, a young couple came up to me and said, "You made history come alive." It was the most meaningful praise I had received in years. Helen, too, had found her new purpose. She volunteered twice a week at the small rural clinic in town. She, who had spent 40 years in the chaos of a big city pediatric ward, was now in her element, but on her own terms. This was not a job. It was an act of service, freely given. She comforted scared children getting their first shots, her calm, gentle voice a magic that no amount of medical training can teach. She counseled young, first-time mothers who were overwhelmed and frightened. She was not just a nurse. She was the town's grandmother, a source of quiet wisdom and profound compassion. Our volunteer work did more than just fill our days. It wove us into the very fabric of our new community. We were no longer the two quiet retirees who had bought the old Miller cabin. I was Mr. Charles. The history buff Helen was Miss Helen from the clinic. We were greeted by name at the post office and the grocery store. We were building new identities, not based on our son or our past lives in Atlanta, but on the people we were right here, right now. We had found a new kind of family, a community built on mutual respect and shared purpose. One evening, we were sitting on our porch, tired in the best possible way, our bodies aching from a day of walking the battlefield and a day of comforting sick children. We were watching the fireflies begin their nightly glittering dance over the lake. "Do you remember those awful charity galas we used to have to go to in Atlanta?" Helen asked, her voice a soft murmur in the twilight. I chuckled, the memory feeling like it was from another man's life. How could I forget? Bad food, boring speeches, and having to make small talk with people we couldn't stand. It was all a performance, she said, her voice thoughtful. All about status, about being seen, about obligation. She looked out at the dark, quiet lake. This work we're doing now, we don't get paid a penny for it, but I feel richer than I ever have in my entire life. I knew exactly what she meant. We had spent our lives working for a living. We were now, finally, living for our work. The next week, a letter arrived. It was not a bill or a piece of junk mail. It was a single thin envelope, addressed to both of us in our son Michael's familiar, slightly messy handwriting. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was the first direct, personal communication we had received from him since the day of the Exodus. We sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time, both of us hesitant to open it. Was it a letter of rage? A formal disownment? A demand for an apology? Finally, I took a deep breath and carefully slid it open. Helen read it over my shoulder. The letter was short, the words stilted and awkward, the words of a young man who did not know how to admit he was wrong. Mom and Dad, it began. I hope you are both well. Things here have been difficult. Tiffany is not happy. Her family has been complaining that they won't be getting their usual lake vacation this year, and they are putting a lot of pressure on our marriage. She says I should have stood up to you more. I don't know what she expected me to do. He then wrote about his job, about the weather, and then the final, crucial sentence. I've been thinking a lot about that night. I think I am beginning to understand what you meant about respect. I hope you're both well. It was not an apology. It was not a request for reconciliation. But it was a crack. A tiny, hairline crack in the thick, solid wall of his anger and his entitlement. We read the letter twice, the silence of our kitchen filled with the weight of that one fragile sentence. He was beginning to see the consequences of his choices, the true nature of the family he had chosen over us. It was not a resolution. It was not forgiveness. But for the first time in a long and painful month, it was a flicker of hope. And as we sat there in our new, quiet, and purposeful life, I knew that we were finally strong enough and peaceful enough to simply wait and see what, if anything, would grow from that tiny, struggling seed. We did not reply to Michael's letter. Helen and I read it together one last time. Then we folded it and placed it in a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, a place for things to be remembered, but not immediately acted upon. The seed of his understanding had been planted, but it needed time to grow in the difficult soil of his own life. We would not rush it. We had learned, in our newfound peace, the profound wisdom of waiting. Life in the mountains settled into a beautiful, gentle rhythm. Autumn arrived, and the Blue Ridge Mountains set themselves on fire, the rolling hills a breathtaking tapestry of crimson, gold, and orange. Our days were full, not with the stressful, obligatory socializing of our old life, but with a quiet, meaningful purpose. My tours at the battlefield became a local favorite, and Helen's gentle presence at the clinic made her one of the most beloved volunteers. We had built a life that was small, simple, and entirely our own. And we were happy. A deep, steady, and uncomplicated happiness that I had not known was even possible. The silence from our son lasted for another 2 months. And then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was him. "Mom? Dad?" he said, his voice small and hesitant, a voice I had not heard since he was a little boy who had just broken a neighbor's window. "We're here, son," I said, my own voice gentle. Helen, who had been in the kitchen, came and stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, and then I heard a sound that I had never, in his 40 years of life, heard from my son. A choked, ragged sob. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words a torrent of long overdue confession. "I am so sorry. I was a coward. I was a fool. I let them treat you like that. There's no excuse for it. I was wrong, and I am so sorry for the pain I caused you." Helen and I just listened, our hearts aching, as our son finally, completely, broke down. He told us that his marriage to Tiffany was in trouble, that he could no longer stand the constant, shallow materialism of her family, their endless demands, their complete lack of respect for anything but money. "You raised me better than that," he said, his voice thick with shame. "And I let you down." "We love you, Michael," Helen said, her own tears now flowing freely. "We have never, not for 1 second, stopped loving you." After he had composed himself, he made a tentative, hopeful request. "I was wondering," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "if it would be all right. Could I maybe come up and see you both? This weekend? Just me." Alone, Helen looked at me, her eyes full of a mother's boundless, hopeful love. I nodded. It was time. "Of course, son," I said. "We'd like that very much. Your room is waiting for you." He arrived that Saturday, not in a fancy SUV packed with the clutter of his other life, but in his own simple car. He looked thinner, tired, but the arrogant, entitled edge he had worn during the invasion was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber humility. He walked into our clean, peaceful home, looking around at the simple, comfortable furniture, at the books on the shelves, at the quiet order of it all. It's really nice, Mom," he said, as if seeing it for the first time. "It's a home." The visit was awkward at first, the three of us navigating the fragile, unspoken territory of our new relationship. We made small talk. We drank coffee. And then, as we were sitting on the porch, in the very chairs where Helen and I had made our stand, he finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air. What was it really like, Mom?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the placid surface of the lake. "After we all arrived, what was it really like for you two?" I looked at Helen, and she took a deep, steadying breath. It was time for him to know the full truth, not as an accusation, but as a testimony. Gently, and without a trace of anger or bitterness in her voice, she told him. She told him about being kicked out of our own bedroom, about the constant, critical demands, about my father's broken fishing rod. And she told him about that last, terrible night, about her sitting on this very porch, weeping, her spirit completely and utterly broken. I watched my son's face as his mother spoke, and I saw the boy I had raised, the good, compassionate boy I thought I had lost, finally return. He was not just hearing her words. He was feeling the full, crushing weight of them. His face was a mask of dawning, horrified shame. The long, cold winter of our estrangement was over. The slow, painful, and necessary work of the spring thaw had just begun. Michael sat on the porch swing, his head in his hands, as the full weight of his mother's quiet, devastating testimony settled upon him. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to defend himself. He just sat there and absorbed the truth of his own failure. And I saw in his face the profound and painful shame of a good man who realizes he has done a very bad thing. I went inside and came back a moment later with my father's broken fishing rod. I sat down in the rocking chair beside him and placed the 2 pieces of splintered bamboo across my lap. "This," I said quietly, "this is what hurt the most, son. Not the money, not the mess, not even being kicked out of our own bed. It was this. It was watching you stand by and let them treat something so sacred to me, to our family's history, like a piece of worthless junk. It was watching you choose their casual amusement over your own father's heart." He looked at the broken rod, and a fresh wave of shame washed over him. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I was a coward." "Yes, you were," I said, not with anger, but with a sad, simple honesty. "But the question now is, what are you going to do about it?" And so, we began the slow, quiet work of repair. I brought out the small, specialized kit I had for maintaining the old rods, the wood glue, the fine silk thread for the windings, the varnish. Side by side, in the quiet of the late afternoon, a father and his son began to mend more than just a piece of bamboo. As we worked, our hands busy, our eyes focused on the delicate task, he began to talk. He told me about the aftermath of their disastrous vacation. He told me that his marriage to Tiffany was, for all intents and purposes, over. The final straw had been his decision to come here today. When he had told her he was coming to see us to apologize, she had exploded in a fit of rage, accusing him of betraying her family, of choosing his selfish parents over her. It was like a switch had been flipped, he said, his voice full of a weary disbelief. All the charm, all the sweetness, it was just gone. And all that was left was this cold, hard, greedy person I didn't even recognize. She said that the whole point of our marriage was to unite the families, to give her parents access to the comfort you two could provide. She said I had failed in my duty as a husband. "Her duty was to you, Michael," Helen said softly from the doorway. "Not to her parents' vacation plans." "I know that now," he said. "I see it all so clearly. I wasn't a husband to her. I was a bridge to you. And when you burned that bridge, she had no use for me anymore." He looked up at us, his eyes full of a new, hard-earned wisdom. "I'm leaving her," he said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I am not going to spend the rest of my life as a pawn in their sick, entitled game." We finished repairing the rod just as the sun began to set. The mend was a fine, almost invisible line, the silk winding a slightly different color from the original, a permanent, visible scar. It would never be perfect again, but it was whole. It was strong. Michael left that evening. The goodbye was different this time. It was not the angry departure of a spoiled boy, nor the awkward return of a penitent son. It was a quiet, respectful farewell between 3 adults who had been through a fire and had come out the other side, scarred but stronger. The weeks that followed were the most peaceful of my life. Helen and I fell back into our quiet routine, but it was richer now, fuller. The final painful piece of our old life had been put to rest, and our future felt truly, completely our own. One cool evening, about a month later, the phone rang. It was Michael. His voice was tired, but steady. The divorce proceedings with Tiffany had begun, and they were, as expected, ugly. "Mom, Dad," he said after a moment of hesitation. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. Ever again. But I'm in a bit of a tough spot. The house is being sold as part of the settlement, and I have to be out by the end of the week. I don't really have anywhere to go right now. I looked at Helen, and I saw the answer in her eyes before she even spoke. The fierce, unconditional, and boundless love of a mother. She took the phone from my hand. "Of course, my love," she said, her voice warm and full of a joy that brought tears to my eyes. "Of course, you can come here. Your room has always been waiting for you." She hung up the phone and looked at me, her face shining with a happiness I hadn't seen in years. Our small, perfect cabin, the home we had fought a war to empty, the sanctuary we had built for two, was about to welcome its first, true, and deeply honored guest. Michael moved in the following weekend. He arrived with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, the humble sum of a life that was in the process of being completely dismantled and rebuilt. He was quiet, respectful, and walked into our home not as a son returning to his parents' house, but as a guest, an honored guest, who understood the profound grace he was being offered. The weeks that followed were a quiet, delicate dance of healing. Our small 2-bedroom cabin became a sanctuary for 3. This was not a return to the old familiar dynamic of a parent-child relationship. This was something new. Michael was not the entitled man-child who had descended upon us months ago. He was a 40-year-old man grappling with the wreckage of his own choices, and we were the 2 people who had given him a safe harbor to do so. He refused to be a burden. He insisted on buying groceries, on cooking meals, on doing his share of the chores. He found a temporary part-time job at the local hardware store, a humble position that was a world away from his old life as a high-powered lawyer in Atlanta. He was, for the first time in his life, earning his own keep, and I could see the quiet, steady pride it gave him. Our days were filled with the simple, therapeutic work of repair. Michael and I spent a weekend in the garage, meticulously restoring my father's broken fishing rod. As we worked, sanding the delicate bamboo, winding the fine silk thread, we talked. We talked for hours, not about the painful past, but about the uncertain future. He spoke of his disillusionment with the law, with the greedy, soulless world Tiffany and her family inhabited. He spoke of a desire for a simpler, more meaningful life, a life where a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his house or the price of his car. I didn't give him advice. I just listened. And in that shared, quiet work, the broken pieces of our own relationship were slowly, carefully, and strongly mended. One evening, we invited Miss Hattie over for dinner. She sat at our small kitchen table, a quiet, observant queen, and watched the 3 of us interact. She saw the easy, respectful way Michael spoke to his mother. She saw the shared laughter. She saw the new, unbreakable team we had become. Later, as she and I sat on the porch, she put a warm, dry hand on my arm. "You see, Charles," she said, her voice a low, knowing murmur. "Sometimes you have to burn the whole damn field down to the root. It's the only way to get rid of the weeds so that something new and strong can finally grow in its place." 2 months after he arrived, Michael announced that he was ready to leave. He had saved up enough money from his job at the hardware store to rent a small apartment in town. He was not running away from us. He was walking toward his own, new, independent life. The pride I felt in that moment was a feeling so pure and so profound, it almost took my breath away. This was the man I had always hoped my son would become. We helped him move his few belongings into his new apartment. It wasn't much, just a couple of rooms above the town bakery, but It was his. It was a life he was building for himself. As we were about to leave, he pulled us both into a fierce, heartfelt hug. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Not just for the room. Thank you for showing me what a home is really supposed to feel like. Thank you for showing me what respect looks like. Thank you for everything." That evening, Helen and I drove back to our cabin. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the lake. We were just the two of us again. Our house was quiet once more, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the empty, haunted silence of a fortress after a siege. It was the rich, peaceful, and contented silence of a sanctuary, a home that had served its purpose, a home that had healed its own. We sat on our porch, in our rocking chairs, and held hands as the last of the light faded from the sky. Our perfect, peaceful retirement had started with a storm of unimaginable chaos and heartbreak. We had been invaded, disrespected, and broken. We had lost a son, and then, miraculously, we had found him again. The quiet of the mountains settled around us, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the memories of a hard, necessary battle won, full of the forgiveness that had been earned, and full of the beautiful, certain knowledge that the son we had lost had finally, completely, and truly come home.